My brother-in-law declared himself the CEO of our family's company after my sister died. His jaw dropped when the lawyer gave him a reality check. My brother-in-law Mark had been measuring my sister Rachel's office since the day the doctors said terminal. 3 weeks before she actually passed, he was already on the phone with furniture stores, asking about executive desk delivery times. He'd told his drinking buddy Carl that Rachel's death was unfortunate, but also an opportunity for fresh leadership. The company needs someone with bigger vision, he'd said while Rachel was still breathing through tubes. Someone who understands modern business, not this old-fashioned family nonsense. Mark had never worked a day at Hanjin Manufacturing, but he'd watched enough business podcasts to think he was qualified. The morning after Rachel's funeral, Mark arrived at the company at 6 a.m. with a locksmith. He had the man change the locks on Rachel's office while maintenance was still cleaning. By the time employees started arriving at 8, Mark was already sitting behind Rachel's desk, her personal items boxed up in the hallway. He'd even brought a nameplate he'd ordered online. Mark Reese, President and CEO. No discussion, no board meeting, just Mark declaring himself in charge because he'd been married to Rachel for 7 years. Our CFO, Mrs. Rena, walked in to find Mark going through confidential files. "Excuse me, what are you doing?" Mark didn't even look up. "Getting familiar with my company's finances. There's a lot of waste here. Going to have to make cuts." Mrs. Rena stood frozen. "Your company?" Mark finally looked at her. "My wife ran this company. Now she's gone, so it passes to me. That's how marriage works. Shared assets. What's hers becomes mine." He'd already sent emails from Rachel's computer announcing his immediate takeover, telling department heads there would be mandatory meetings to discuss restructuring. His nephew Kyle was being brought in as operations manager. Kyle was 22 and had just been fired from a sandwich shop for stealing. I arrived at the office to find chaos. Employees were standing in clusters, confused and angry. Mark had posted a new organizational chart in the break room with himself at the top, and all of Rachel's trusted managers demoted or removed entirely. When I walked into Rachel's office, Mark was on a conference call with our biggest client. "Yes, as the new owner, I'm thinking we need to renegotiate rates. 30% increase seems fair." I disconnected the call. "Mark, you need to leave." He leaned back in Rachel's chair like he owned it. "Actually, Jordan, you need to leave. I'm having security escort you out later today. Can't have hostile family members disrupting my business." "Your business?" I kept my voice steady. "You think you own Hanjin Manufacturing?" Mark pulled out a folder he'd prepared. "Marriage is a legal partnership. Rachel owned this company. As her surviving spouse, I inherit her assets. It's basic law. I've already had Kyle start boxing up your office, too. We're turning it into a meditation room. Progressive leadership." That's when Mrs. Irina returned with our company attorney, Mr. Huang. He was carrying a thick leather folder and looked oddly pleased. "Mr. Reese," he said cheerfully, "I heard you've declared yourself the new owner." Mark stood up, trying to look imposing. "Not declared. Inherited. I'm Rachel's legal heir." Mr. Huang opened his folder. "Interesting. And what exactly do you think you've inherited?" Mark was getting annoyed. This company. All of it. Rachel's shares, her position, her authority. Mr. Huang pulled out a document. "Could you tell me what percentage of Hanjin Manufacturing Rachel owned?" Mark scoffed. "All of it, obviously. She was the CEO. Actually, Mr. Huang said, flipping pages, Rachel owned exactly 0% of Hanjin Manufacturing." Mark's face went pale. "That's impossible. She ran everything. Running and owning are entirely different concepts. Rachel was an employee. A highly paid employee with the title of CEO, but still an employee. She received a salary, benefits, and a performance bonus, but she didn't own a single share." Mark grabbed the documents. "But her father founded this company. Her family built it." Mr. Huang nodded patiently. "Yes, Mr. Hanjin founded it, and he structured it very specifically. The company is owned entirely by the Hanjin Holdings Corporation. That corporation has exactly 2 shareholders. Jordan here owns 51%, and the Hanjin Employee Trust owns 49%. But Rachel was a Hanjin. She had to own something. She had the option to purchase shares, Mr. Huang explained, but she never exercised it. She preferred taking her compensation in cash rather than equity. You'd know this if you'd ever actually looked at her employment contract." Mark was sweating now. His face shifted from pale white to deep red, the color spreading up from his collar like someone had poured hot liquid under his skin. Mark slammed both hands on the desk and pushed himself up, the chair rolling backward and hitting the wall behind him. "This is impossible," he shouted, his voice cracking on the last word. "My lawyer told me marriage means automatic inheritance. That's how the law works. You're all conspiring against me, trying to steal what's rightfully mine." He pointed at me, then at Mr. Huang, his finger shaking. "You planned this, didn't you? Waited until Rachel was gone so you could push me out." Mrs. Irina pulled her phone from her jacket pocket and held it up, the screen facing Mark. "I'm recording this," she said quietly, "just so we have a record of your behavior." Mark's eyes went wide when he saw the phone, but he didn't stop talking. "Record whatever you want," he said, but his voice was less sure now. This whole thing is illegal and my lawyer will prove it. I watched his fantasy crumble in real time, saw the exact moment when the reality started pushing through his denial. He'd been planning this takeover for weeks, maybe months, measuring the office and ordering nameplates and telling Kyle they'd finally have real money. Now Mr. Huang was showing him documents that said he owned nothing, had inherited nothing, would walk away with nothing. Mr. Huang reached into his folder and pulled out another document, this one clipped to several pages of dense text. "Let me show you something else," he said, his voice still calm and almost friendly. Rachel had the option to purchase company shares at any time during her employment. See here, this clause in her contract from 15 years ago, when your father-in-law restructured the business. Mark grabbed the papers and studied them, his eyes moving fast across the lines. He flipped to the second page, then the third, clearly looking for something that would support his claim. Rachel's signature sat at the bottom of page 4, clear and unmistakable in blue ink. She chose salary compensation instead, Mr. Huang continued. Higher base pay, better benefits, annual bonuses tied to company performance. She made that choice deliberately because she wanted financial flexibility, not equity ownership. Mark kept staring at the signature like he could make it disappear through sheer force of will. When he found nothing that helped him, he threw the whole stack of papers across the desk. They scattered and some fell to the floor. "You forged this," he said, but even he didn't sound convinced. "You faked Rachel's signature to cut me out." Kyle, who'd been standing near the door looking uncomfortable this whole time, actually took a step back. "Uncle Mark," he said quietly, "that looks like Aunt Rachel's signature." Mark spun toward him. "Shut up, Kyle. You don't know what you're talking about." But Kyle just shook his head and looked at the floor. I finally found my voice and stood up from where I'd been leaning against the wall. "Mark, you have 1 hour to get your stuff and leave," I said. "Not your stuff. The things you brought this morning. Rachel's personal items stay here until we can properly sort through them." Mark laughed, but it was bitter and ugly. "You can't throw me out," he said. "I'm family. Rachel would want me here." He moved toward me like he might try to intimidate me with his size. "I know this business better than you ever will, Jordan. I've been listening to Rachel talk about it for 7 years. You just show up now because some papers say you own shares?" Mr. Huang stepped between us before Mark could get too close. "Actually, as majority shareholder, Jordan has full authority to remove anyone from company property," he said. "That includes you, Mr. Reese. Security is already waiting outside." Mark looked at the door, then back at me. His jaw was tight and I could see the muscles working. For a second I thought he might actually try to fight, might grab me or push Mr. Huang out of the way. But then his shoulders slumped just a little, and I knew he understood that this was really happening. Mark's whole attitude changed in an instant, like someone had flipped a switch. His face softened and his voice dropped to something quieter, sadder. "Rachel loved me," he said, and his eyes actually got wet. She would be heartbroken to see her family fighting like this, to see her brother throwing her husband out of the company she built. He looked at me with what was probably supposed to be wounded sincerity. "She always talked about us taking over together someday, about building this company side by side. She had such big plans for what we could do, the vision we shared for the future." I felt anger flash hot in my chest because I knew exactly how much Rachel had tolerated Mark's business advice. She'd complained to me dozens of times about his suggestions, his podcast wisdom, his ideas for modernizing operations that showed he understood nothing about manufacturing. She'd actively avoided discussing company matters with him because every conversation turned into Mark explaining what she should do differently. The idea that they had some shared vision was complete fiction, something Mark had invented in his own head while Rachel nodded politely and then ignored everything he said. Miss Rena cleared her throat and Mark turned to look at her. "I need to correct something you just said," she stated, her voice steady and professional. "Rachel specifically told me last month that you should never have access to company finances or operations. She was very clear about that." Mark's face went dark, the fake grief vanishing instantly. "You're lying," he said. "Mrs. Arena didn't flinch. She told me she was worried about your spending habits," she continued. "About your tendency to make big decisions without thinking through the results. She wanted to make sure that if anything happened to her, you wouldn't be able to damage what she'd spent 15 years building." Mark took 2 steps toward Mrs. Arena, and I moved to block him. "What else have you been saying behind my back?" he demanded, his voice rising again. "How long have you been poisoning everyone against me?" Mrs. Arena just looked at him calmly. "I haven't said anything to anyone except what Rachel explicitly told me to share if this exact situation happened," she said. "She knew you'd try this, Mark. She prepared for it." Mr. Huang made a small gesture toward the door and it opened. 2 security guards stepped inside, both of them guys I recognized from the morning shift. Mark saw them and his face went through about 5 different expressions in 2 seconds. He looked at the guards, then at me, then at the desk like he was calculating whether he had time to grab anything. He started moving fast, snatching up random items from Rachel's desk. He grabbed the framed photos of her and our parents, the little plant she'd kept by her computer for years, a coffee mug with the company logo. "These belong to me," he said, clutching them against his chest. "I'm her husband. This stuff is mine." I stepped forward and put my hand on the desk between us. You can collect Rachel's personal things later through proper channels, I said. Right now, you need to leave this building. The guards moved closer, not threatening, but making it clear they were ready to help him leave if necessary. Mark's eyes darted around the office like he was looking for something else to claim, some other piece of Rachel he could take with him. Kyle finally spoke up from his spot near the door. You're being disrespectful to family during a time of grief, he said, his voice cracking a little. We should honor Rachel's memory by keeping Uncle Mark involved in what she built. He looked at me like I was the villain here. This is what she would have wanted. I turned to face Kyle directly. What qualifications do you have to be operations manager? I asked him, besides being Mark's nephew. Kyle's mouth opened and closed. I have fresh perspectives, he said. New ideas about efficiency and workflow. I studied business concepts online. Name one thing we manufacture here, I said. Tell me about any single aspect of our production process. Kyle stammered something about streamlining and optimization, words he'd probably heard in a YouTube video. But when I pressed him for specifics, he couldn't name our products, couldn't describe our clients, couldn't explain what the operations department actually does on a daily basis. He just stood there looking young and lost and completely out of his depth. Mark finally headed toward the door, but he stopped in the doorway and turned back. My lawyer will be in touch, he said, his voice hard again. You haven't heard the last of this. I'm going to fight for what Rachel would have wanted, and you're going to regret pushing me out like this. He looked at each of us in turn, trying to make it intimidating. The security guards waited patiently for him to finish. Then Mark walked out with Kyle trailing behind him, and the office fell silent. I could hear my own breathing, could feel my heart pounding from the adrenaline. My hands were shaking slightly, and I stuck them in my pockets so no one would see. I sank into one of the chairs along the wall, suddenly exhausted. Mrs. Arena walked over and put her hand on my shoulder. Rachel chose you as majority shareholder for exactly this reason, she said quietly. She knew you'd protect what she built. I spent the rest of the day moving from the office to the office, meeting with department heads to explain what had just happened. Each conversation followed the same pattern. I'd outline the ownership situation, confirm that Mark had no role in the company, and reassure them that operations would continue normally. Several people admitted they'd been scared Mark would actually take over. Sarah from accounting said she'd been updating her resume that morning. Tom from sales mentioned he'd gotten calls from recruiters and had almost called them back. They were all terrified Mark would run the company into the ground with his podcast business theories. Linus, our operations director, pulled me aside after the main meeting. He was a big guy with gray hair and 20 years of experience, someone Rachel had trusted completely. Kyle tried to reorganize the entire production schedule yesterday, he told me, based on some YouTube video about efficiency he'd watched. Nearly caused us to miss a major shipment to Thompson Industrial. I had to basically redo everything after he left. Linus shook his head. If Mark had actually taken over, half the senior staff would have quit within a month. Mr. Huang stayed late, long after everyone else had gone home. We sat in the conference room with coffee, and he walked me through every possible legal challenge Mark might try. Spousal inheritance claims based on community property, he said, making notes on a yellow pad. Wrongful termination suits even though Mark was never actually employed here. Challenges to the corporate structure claiming it was set up specifically to disinherit him. He looked up at me. Everything is legally solid, Jordan. Your father set this up carefully 15 years ago, with exactly this kind of situation in mind. But Mark could make things expensive and time-consuming if he's determined to fight. How expensive? I asked. Mr. He Huang considered. Legal fees could run into 6 figures if he really pushes every angle, he said. Plus the distraction, the stress on staff, potential concerns from clients who hear about family disputes. I thought about Rachel, about everything she'd built, about the employees who depended on this company staying stable. Whatever it costs, I said. Whatever legal budget you need, you have it. I'm not letting Mark's delusions destroy what Rachel spent 15 years building. Mr. Huang nodded and made another note. Then let's make sure we're prepared for whatever he tries next, he said. That evening, I walked back into Rachel's office alone. The building was empty now, just the hum of the heating system and my footsteps on the carpet. I turned on the lights and stood in the doorway for a minute, taking it all in. Mark had tried to erase her in a morning, but he'd barely made a dent. Her certification still hung on the wall in neat frames. Quality Management, 6 Sigma Black Belt, Industry Leadership Award from 2019. Photos covered her credenza, pictures of company milestones. The day we shipped our 1,000th unit. The ribbon cutting when we opened the new production wing. The whole staff at last year's holiday party, Rachel in the center with that genuine smile she had when she was proud of something. Thank you notes from employees were pinned to a corkboard beside her desk. Handwritten messages thanking her for approving time off for a family emergency, for helping someone's kid get a summer internship, for remembering birthdays and work anniversaries. I picked up the coffee mug sitting on her desk, the one I'd given her 3 Christmases ago as a joke. World's okayest CEO in big letters. She'd used it every single day. There was still a coffee ring inside. My hands started shaking and I set the mug down carefully before I dropped it. The weight of everything hit me all at once. Rachel was gone. Actually gone. Not coming back. And she'd left me in charge of all of this. Every person who worked here, every client who trusted us, every employee family that depended on steady paychecks. I sank into her chair and put my head in my hands. The tears came hard and fast, the kind of crying that hurts your chest. I'd held it together through the funeral, through the confrontation with Mark, through all the meetings today. But sitting in her office, surrounded by her life's work, I finally broke down. I cried for my sister, for the conversations we'd never have, for the advice she'd never give me. I cried because I was scared I'd mess this up, that I'd let down everyone she cared about. I cried because she'd trusted me with something huge, and I wasn't sure I deserved that trust. The next morning I got to the office early, eyes still puffy from crying. My assistant had a stack of messages waiting, but the first thing I saw was an email from Mrs. Rena with the subject line, URGENT. Mark's attorney had sent a formal letter overnight, demanding immediate reinstatement as CEO, and claiming Rachel had made verbal promises that constituted a binding agreement. I forwarded it to Mr. Huang and called him directly. He was already reading it when he picked up. "This is desperate and baseless," he said. "I'm drafting our response now." The attorney's letter also demanded Mark receive Rachel's final paycheck, her unused vacation payout, and continuation of her health insurance benefits. Mr. Huang explained that those were actually legitimate claims as her surviving spouse, things we'd have to honor regardless of the ownership dispute. I authorized him to process those payments immediately because I didn't want to fight over things Mark was legally entitled to. Within an hour, Mr. Huang sent his response with copies of Rachel's employment contract, corporate bylaws, and most importantly, a memo Rachel had written to the board 2 years ago, explicitly stating that company ownership and operations must remain separate from her personal life. She'd actually documented her wishes in writing, probably knowing Mark might try something eventually. The attorney's letter was full of emotional language about Rachel's intentions and Mark's sacrifices, but Mr. Huang's response was pure facts and legal citations, no room for interpretation. Mrs. Rena came to my office mid-morning looking worried. She'd been going through email logs and discovered something disturbing. Mark had used Rachel's computer to send messages to 3 of our major clients while he was pretending to be CEO. The emails suggested significant price increases and contract renegotiations, claiming new leadership meant new terms. 2 clients had already responded with concern about company stability and questions about whether our management was actually changing. I felt sick reading the forwarded messages. Mark had actively tried to damage our business relationships in less than 24 hours. I spent the rest of the morning on damage control calls, explaining to each client that Rachel had passed away, that I was the actual owner, and that Mark had no authority whatsoever to make any business decisions. I confirmed that all existing contracts remained valid, pricing stayed the same, and operations would continue unchanged under our experienced management team. Most clients were understanding once I explained the situation, but I could hear the concern in their voices. A family dispute playing out in business communications didn't exactly inspire confidence. I promised each one that I'd send formal documentation of the ownership structure and my contact information as the primary point of contact going forward. The Thompson Industrial call was different, though. Their purchasing manager mentioned something that made my blood run cold. Apparently, the new CEO, Mark, had called them directly yesterday, before the lawyer meeting, offering an exclusive partnership opportunity. He'd pitched it as a chance to become our sole supplier for certain components in exchange for a large upfront payment that would help us expand production capacity. The purchasing manager had been suspicious because Rachel had never mentioned expansion plans, which is why he was calling to verify. I realized immediately what Mark had been trying to do. He was running a scam, using Rachel's death as cover to extract money from our clients before anyone could stop him. If Thompson had sent that payment to whatever account Mark set up, the money would have disappeared, and we'd be liable for the fraud. I thanked the purchasing manager for his caution and assured him no such partnership existed. After I hung up, I called Mr. Huang again and told him what I'd learned. He added it to our documentation with a note that we might need to pursue legal action beyond just removing Mark from the premises. This wasn't just a failed takeover attempt anymore. Mark had actively tried to commit fraud against our clients. Around 2 in the afternoon, Teresa from HR knocked on my door looking stressed. She had a folder full of complaint forms, a dozen employees who'd submitted formal complaints about Kyle's behavior during his brief management tenure. I told her to sit down and walked me through each one. Kyle had spent yesterday afternoon on the production floor telling the team their methods were outdated and inefficient. He'd criticized their work ethic, saying they moved too slowly and lacked urgency. He'd suggested replacing half the staff with younger workers who'd accept lower wages and have more energy. Several long-term employees were genuinely upset, people who'd worked at Hanjin for 10 or 15 years. They were questioning whether the company culture would survive Rachel's death, whether new ownership meant everything would change. Teresa said morale was low and people were scared. Some had started updating resumes. I asked her to set up an all-staff meeting for later that afternoon. Rachel had done monthly meetings to keep everyone informed and connected, something I'd occasionally attended but never led. It was time for me to step up and address their concerns directly. The conference room was packed when I walked in at 4. Every chair filled, people standing along the walls, faces worried and uncertain. I'd prepared some notes but decided to just speak honestly instead. I explained the ownership structure clearly, how my father had set up Hanjin Holdings with me as majority shareholder and the employee trust holding the rest. I confirmed that Mark had no role in the company, never had, and never would. I promised that Rachel's values and leadership approach would continue, that protecting jobs and maintaining our culture mattered more than short-term profits. When I mentioned that Rachel had specifically was chosen this ownership structure to protect the company and the employees she considered family, several people started crying. An older woman from accounting wiped her eyes with a tissue. A young guy from shipping put his head down. I felt my own throat getting tight and had to pause for a second to keep it together. I told them Rachel had trusted me to do right by everyone here, and I wouldn't let her down. Questions came after that. Practical stuff about whether their benefits would change, whether we'd be hiring or cutting staff, whether clients were staying with us. I answered everything honestly, admitted when I didn't know something yet, and promised to keep them informed as I learned more about running the company. The mood shifted gradually from scared to cautiously hopeful. People nodded, made eye contact, seemed to relax slightly. After I wrapped up, several employees came up to thank me for being direct with them. Linus shook my hand and said Rachel would be proud. Vincent approached me as people were filing out. He was holding a sealed envelope, the kind you'd use for important documents. He asked if we could talk privately, so we went back to my office and he closed the door. Rachel gave this to me 6 weeks ago, he said quietly. She told me to give it to you if anything happened to her, and if Mark tried to claim company ownership. His hands were shaking slightly as he handed it over. Inside was a handwritten letter on Rachel's personal stationery, her neat handwriting filling 3 pages. I recognized it immediately, the way she made her capital letters, the slight rightward slant. Vincent sat across from me while I read, watching my face. The letter started with an apology. She was sorry for not telling me sooner about her concerns regarding Mark, sorry for putting this burden on me, sorry for not being there to help me through the transition. Then she explained everything. Mark had been pressuring her for years to make him a partner, or give him an official role in the company. It started small, suggestions that he could help with marketing or business development, even though he had no experience. After her diagnosis, he became more insistent. He'd bring it up during her chemo appointments while she was weak and sick, saying she needed to think about succession planning, and he was the obvious choice. She'd caught him researching business valuations on her laptop. She'd overheard him on the phone with brokers asking about procedures for selling manufacturing companies. He saw her illness as an opportunity, not a tragedy. A chance to finally get his hands on what he'd always wanted. Rachel wrote that she chose me as majority shareholder because I understood the company's mission. I'd grown up watching our father build it, had worked summer jobs on the production floor, knew the employees and cared about them as people rather than resources. She trusted me to protect what the company meant, not just what it was worth. The letter was dated 6 weeks before she died, written on a day when she must have known time was running out. Her handwriting got shakier toward the end, like it hurt to hold the pen. The last page contained Rachel's personal assessment of Mark's character, written with the blunt honesty of someone who knows they're dying and has nothing left to lose. She described his financial irresponsibility, how he'd blown through his inheritance from his own parents within 2 years, his tendency to see people as resources to exploit rather than human beings with their own value, his complete lack of understanding about how actual businesses work. Thinking podcast advice and motivational videos made him qualified to run a manufacturing company. She wrote that she regretted not divorcing him before she got sick, but by the time she realized how bad things were, she was too weak to deal with legal proceedings. She ended by saying she trusted me completely and knew I'd do right by everyone who depended on Hanjin Manufacturing. I looked up at Vincent when I finished reading. He was watching me carefully. She made me promise not to reveal that letter unless absolutely necessary, he said. She didn't want to publicly shame Mark despite everything. She hoped he'd accept the situation and move on quietly. I felt anger rising in my chest, hot and sharp. Rachel had protected Mark's dignity even while dying, even knowing what he'd tried to do. She'd tried to avoid exactly the chaos we were now experiencing. I asked Vincent if anyone else knew about the letter. He shook his head. Just you and me now. Rachel's instructions were very specific. I called Mr. Huang and told him about the letter. He asked me to scan and send it immediately. When he called back 20 minutes later, he sounded pleased. This significantly strengthens our position if Mark escalates legally, he said. It's direct evidence of Rachel's intentions written in her own hand while she was mentally competent. Any claims about verbal promises or implied agreements fall apart when we have her explicit written statement. Vincent mentioned that Rachel had made him promise not to use the letter unless Mark forced the issue. She didn't want to hurt him publicly if she could avoid it, Mr. Wang said quietly. Even after everything he put her through, I felt a mix of admiration for my sister's compassion and frustration at her protecting someone who didn't deserve it. But I understood her reasoning. She'd been trying to prevent exactly the ugly public battle we were now fighting. She'd hoped Mark would accept reality and walk away. She'd been wrong about that, but she'd prepared for the possibility by giving me the letter through Vincent. 2 days after Vincent gave me Rachel's letter, Mr. Huang called with bad news. Mark's attorney had filed a formal claim with the probate court, arguing that Rachel's estate should include theoretical value from share purchases she never made. The logic was twisted but legally creative enough to cause problems. Mark claimed that because Rachel could have bought shares at any time during her employment, her decision not to represent a marital asset she'd deliberately withheld from him. His attorney was demanding half the estimated value of those phantom shares, which worked out to millions of dollars Rachel never actually possessed. Mr. Huang explained that while the claim was ridiculous on its face, it could tie up Rachel's actual estate in probate for months or even years. Mark wasn't trying to win, he was trying to create leverage. Rachel's personal savings, her retirement accounts, even the house they'd shared together, all frozen while the courts worked through this manufactured complexity. Mr. Huang warned me that Mark was essentially holding Rachel's legitimate assets hostage, hoping we'd offer a settlement just to make him go away and let the estate close. I spent that night reading through Rachel's financial records that her personal attorney had shared with me as executor. She'd been careful with money, saving consistently and investing wisely. The estate was worth about $800,000 after the house and accounts were totaled up. Not a fortune, but substantial, and Mark wanted half of it plus this imaginary value from shares that existed only in his attorney's creative legal theory. I called Mr. Huang back the next morning and told him I wanted to fight the claim entirely. No settlements, no compromises. He asked if I was sure because litigation would cost money and create uncertainty. I told him I was completely sure because giving Mark anything would validate his exploitation of Rachel's death. The following afternoon, Mrs. Arena requested a meeting in her office to discuss the company's financial position. She'd run projections accounting for potential legal costs and the uncertainty Mark's actions were creating. Her analysis showed we were stable enough to weather an extended legal battle without affecting operations or employee security. Our credit lines were solid, our client relationships were strong, and we had enough cash reserves to handle unexpected expenses. She suggested we could consider a small settlement to make Mark disappear quickly, maybe $50,000 just to close this chapter and move forward. I understood her reasoning but refused immediately. Paying Mark anything would send a message that his behavior worked, that he could exploit Rachel's death for money and face no real consequences. Mrs. Arena nodded slowly and said she'd expected that answer, that she'd actually been testing whether I had the backbone to stand firm. Mr. Huang supports fighting this completely, she added. He thinks Mark's claim is so weak that it might even get dismissed before trial if we file the right motions. She pulled out another document showing our insurance coverage for legal disputes. We had policies that would cover most of the attorney fees for defending against Mark's claims, which meant fighting him wouldn't drain company resources the way he probably hoped it would. That same afternoon, Kyle showed up at the building entrance demanding to be let in. Security called me before allowing him past the lobby. He claimed he needed to collect his office supplies and personal items from the workspace Mark had assigned him. I told security to turn him away because Kyle had never been an actual employee with a contract or assigned workspace. He'd been Mark's unauthorized addition to the building for less than 2 days. Kyle started yelling about illegal firing and family betrayal, loud enough that people in the parking lot turned to watch. Security escorted him off the property while he shouted threats about lawsuits and wrongful termination. Within an hour, he'd posted a long rant on social media about being illegally fired from the family business, tagging Hanjin Manufacturing and several employees by name. He claimed I'd stolen the company from my dying sister and was now purging anyone loyal to Rachel's memory. Teresa from HR called me immediately and said she was already screenshotting everything for our legal file. She pointed out that Kyle was never an employee in any legal sense, just someone Mark brought into the building without authorization or paperwork. No employment contract, no tax forms, no background check, nothing that would make his presence legitimate. His social media tantrum was just proving that Mark's whole takeover attempt had been amateur hour from start to finish. Over the next few days, several employees approached me privately to share stories about Mark's behavior during Rachel's illness. I'd been so focused on my own grief and on supporting Rachel that I'd missed a lot of what was happening at the company. Linus told me that Mark would show up during Rachel's chemotherapy appointments, sitting in her office chair and practicing being CEO. He'd call people into the office for informal chats about their roles and responsibilities, dropping hints about changes he'd make once he was in charge. One production supervisor described Mark telling him that Rachel's management style was too soft, that employees needed tougher accountability and stricter performance metrics. Mark had apparently spent months positioning himself as the inevitable successor, building relationships with people he thought would support his takeover. A vendor relations manager mentioned overhearing Mark on a phone call discussing pricing negotiations. He'd told someone that Rachel was too generous with clients, that he'd be much tougher on rates and contract terms once he took over. The manager had assumed Mark was just venting frustration or daydreaming, not actually planning to seize control the morning after Rachel's funeral. Every story painted the same picture of Mark seeing Rachel's terminal diagnosis not as a tragedy, but as a business opportunity. He'd been measuring the office and planning his takeover while she was still alive, still fighting, still hoping for more time. 3 days after Kyle's social media outburst, I received a call from Rachel's oncologist's office about an outstanding bill. The final round of treatments had cost nearly $40,000 after insurance, and the balance was still unpaid. I immediately offered to cover it from the estate funds, apologizing for the delay. The billing coordinator thanked me, and then mentioned something strange. Mark had called their office the previous week trying to get copies of Rachel's complete medical records. He'd claimed he needed them for insurance purposes, something about filing claims or appeals. The coordinator had refused without proper authorization because medical privacy laws were strict even for surviving spouses in certain situations. She'd found his insistence odd because he'd been aggressive about it, threatening to report them for obstruction if they didn't comply. I thanked her for telling me and said I'd handle the bill within the week. After hanging up, I sat there wondering what Mark had been looking for in those records. Was he trying to find evidence that Rachel had been mentally incompetent near the end? Something he could use to challenge her decisions? Or was he looking for documentation about her illness timeline to support some other legal theory? I mentioned it to Mr. Huang during our next call, and he added it to the growing file of Mark's suspicious behavior. Mr. Huang called back 2 days later with something even more disturbing. He'd been contacted by an insurance company asking about a life insurance claim filed in Mark's name. The claim listed Mark as beneficiary and Hanjin Manufacturing as the insured party, suggesting Rachel had established key person insurance that would pay out upon her death. The insurance company had flagged it as potential fraud because they had no record of any such policy ever existing. They'd contacted our company directly to verify before taking action against Mark. Mr. Huang confirmed that Rachel had never established key person insurance. She'd discussed it years ago, but decided against it because the premiums were high and the company was stable enough without that protection. Mark had apparently assumed such a policy must exist and tried to file a claim without ever verifying the policy was real. The insurance company was considering referring the matter to law enforcement for insurance fraud, but they wanted our input first. Mr. Huang told them to do whatever they felt was appropriate, that we wouldn't interfere with any investigation into Mark's actions. He explained to me that this showed Mark's desperation and poor judgment. Filing false insurance claims was a serious crime, not just a civil matter, and Mark had done it without even checking whether the policy existed first. The Employee Trust Board requested a formal meeting with me the following week. I'd been nervous about facing them because they represented 49% of company ownership and could theoretically make my life difficult if they opposed my leadership. The board consisted of 7 long-term employees elected by their co-workers to oversee the trust's interests. They gathered in the main conference room, and I prepared myself for tough questions about my qualifications and plans. Instead, the board chair opened by expressing confidence in my leadership and serious concern about Mark's disruption. One by one, the board members spoke about their interactions with Rachel over the years, how she'd always emphasized protecting employee interests and maintaining company culture. They said Rachel had told several of them privately that I was her choice to lead the company if anything happened to her. The board voted unanimously to support whatever legal action was necessary to protect the company from Mark's claims. They authorized using company resources to defend against his attacks and made it clear they saw me as Rachel's legitimate successor. Their solidarity meant everything to me because I'd worried some might see me as an inexperienced outsider compared to Rachel. Instead, they saw me as someone Rachel had trusted and prepared for this role. The board chair mentioned that Mark had tried to contact several board members privately, suggesting they should support his leadership instead of mine. Every person he'd contacted had refused to even discuss it and had reported the contact attempts to the board immediately. 2 days after the employee trust meeting, Mr. Huang forwarded me another letter from Mark's attorney. This one threatened to sue me personally for intentional infliction of emotional distress. The letter claimed I was weaponizing Rachel's death against her grieving widower, using my position to punish Mark for loving my sister. It accused me of deliberately causing Mark psychological harm through the legal battles and public humiliation. Mr. Huang called it a desperate intimidation tactic with no legal merit whatsoever. Courts required extreme and outrageous conduct for emotional distress claims, and defending company ownership through proper legal channels didn't come close to meeting that standard. Still, seeing those accusations in writing stung deeply. The letter painted me as a cruel, vindictive person using corporate power to destroy a grieving spouse. I was grieving too, but I didn't have the luxury of falling apart because an entire company depended on stability right now. Mr. Huang assured me the threat was empty, designed to make me emotional and possibly willing to settle just to end the attacks. He said we'd respond with a brief letter dismissing the claims and wouldn't waste time taking the threat seriously. That same week, Rachel's personal attorney contacted me about irregularities in the estate accounting. Mark had emptied their joint bank accounts the day after Rachel died, transferring over $200,000 to an account in only his name. Legally, he had the right to access joint accounts, but the timing and totality of the transfer raised questions about his intentions. The personal attorney was handling the estate division and said this would definitely come up during probate proceedings. Mark's actions showed his priority had been securing money immediately rather than mourning his wife or handling affairs responsibly. I mentioned this to Vincent during one of our regular check-ins about company operations. He just nodded sadly and said Rachel had known Mark would do exactly that. She'd moved most of her personal savings into accounts that weren't joint specifically because she didn't trust Mark not to drain everything the moment she died. Vincent said Rachel had told him she regretted not divorcing Mark years earlier, but by the time she fully understood his character, she was too sick to deal with legal proceedings. She'd focused instead on protecting the company and making sure I had the tools to defend it after she was gone. The following Monday, Riley stopped by my office with an unexpected proposal. She explained that over 40 employees had contributed to a voluntary fund to help cover legal costs if needed. They'd raised several $1,000s within 2 days, wanting to actively support protecting Rachel's legacy from Mark's greed. Riley said the staff was angry about Mark's behavior and wanted to do something concrete to help. I was genuinely moved by their loyalty, and the gesture meant more than they probably realized. But I declined the money, explaining that the company was financially stable and they shouldn't bear the cost of Mark's actions. I told Riley to return the contributions to everyone who donated, with my personal thanks for their support. The fact that they'd organized this effort without being asked showed how much Rachel had meant to them, and how much they trusted that I'd protect what she'd built. Riley smiled and said she'd expected me to refuse the money, that Rachel had always put employees first too, but the staff had needed to offer anyway. It was their way of saying they stood with me and with Rachel's memory against everything Mark represented. I found the first email in my inbox 3 days after the courthouse confrontation. Mark had written to our biggest client, Thompson Industrial, introducing himself as Rachel's widower, and explaining that he'd be consulting on future projects to honor her memory. The email was polished and professional, carefully worded to suggest involvement without making explicit claims. Thompson's purchasing manager forwarded it to me with a simple question mark in the subject line. The second email went to Acme Components, one of our oldest relationships. Mark explained that Rachel had always valued their partnership, and he wanted to continue her tradition of personal attention to their account. He included his cell phone number and suggested they reach out if they had any concerns during this transition period. Acme's owner called me directly, clearly worried about whether our management was falling apart. I spent an hour reassuring him that operations were stable, that Mark had no role in the company, and that our team remained committed to the same quality standards Rachel had established. By the end of the week, I'd received forwarded emails from 5 different clients, all with variations of Mark's message. He was systematically working through our contact list, inserting himself into relationships he'd never been part of. Mrs. Arena helped me draft a formal letter to all clients explaining the organizational structure clearly. I included my contact information, introduced key department heads, and stated explicitly that Mark Reese had no affiliation with Hanjin Manufacturing in any capacity. We sent it to every client in our database, then followed up with personal calls to our top 20 accounts. Most people were understanding once they heard the full situation, though a few admitted Mark's emails had made them nervous about whether we were experiencing internal chaos. The county courthouse sent notification that they'd scheduled a hearing on Mark's estate claims for 3 weeks out. Both sides would have time to prepare arguments and submit evidence. Mr. Huang immediately began assembling our documentation, creating organized binders with Rachel's employment contract, the corporate structure papers, her letter to me, and sworn statements from Mrs. Arena and Vincent about Mark's behavior. He spread everything across the conference table in his office, checking each document for completeness and clarity. The employment contract showed Rachel's compensation structure clearly, with her salary, benefits, and performance bonuses all documented. The corporate papers proved the ownership split between me and the employee trust, with signatures and dates going back years before Rachel's illness. Her letter to me, handwritten and deeply personal, explained her reasoning and her concerns about Mark's character. Vincent's statement described the instructions Rachel gave him about the sealed envelope and her specific warnings about Mark trying to claim company ownership. Mrs. Arena's statement detailed the morning Mark changed the locks, his presumptuous takeover attempt, and Rachel's explicit instructions to keep him separate from business operations. Mr. Huang reviewed everything twice, making notes about which points to emphasize and which witnesses to call. He seemed confident about our position, but warned me that Mark might create a scene in court, that losing would probably trigger an emotional outburst we should be prepared for. I started meeting regularly with department heads to learn the aspects of operations Rachel had handled personally. Linus walked me through the production floor, explaining how raw materials moved through different stations, how quality checks happened at each stage, and how scheduling balanced efficiency with flexibility for rush orders. He showed me the planning boards where upcoming jobs were mapped out, the inventory system that tracked components, and the maintenance logs that prevented equipment breakdowns. Mrs. Arena spent hours explaining financial cycles, showing me when client payments typically arrived, how we managed cash flow during slow periods, and which expenses were fixed versus variable. She walked me through the quarterly reports Rachel had reviewed, pointing out trends and patterns I needed to watch. Riley took me to the engineering department and showed me 3 ongoing projects, explaining the technical challenges, the client requirements, and the innovative solutions her team was developing. She answered my basic questions patiently, never making me feel stupid for not knowing things Rachel had understood instinctively. Everyone was careful with me, speaking slowly and checking that I understood before moving to the next topic. I could sense them collectively deciding whether I was worthy of Rachel's trust, whether I had the capacity to protect what she'd built. Some seemed convinced already, nodding when I asked good questions or made reasonable suggestions. Others were clearly reserving judgment, waiting to see how I handled real challenges before fully accepting my leadership. Vincent approached me one afternoon with a thick binder I'd never seen before. He explained that Rachel had been documenting company processes and decisions in detailed notes specifically, so I could step into leadership if needed. She'd been preparing for this transition for months, creating a roadmap she never got to give me herself. The binder contained everything from client relationship histories, to employee management philosophies, to strategic thinking about market opportunities. Rachel's handwriting filled page after page, organized by topic with cross-references and updates. She'd written about why certain clients required extra attention, which employees had leadership potential, where she saw risks in our supply chain, and what investments she thought we should make over the next 5 years. Finding her notes felt like receiving guidance from beyond the grave, like Rachel was still teaching me even though she was gone. I spent evenings reading her insights, learning how she thought about problems and made decisions. She documented difficult situations she'd handled, explaining her reasoning and what she'd learned from each experience. Some entries were recent, written during her illness when she knew time was running out. Others went back years, showing how her thinking had evolved as the company grew. The notes revealed how much institutional knowledge she'd carried, how many small details and relationships she'd managed personally. I realized I'd never fully appreciated the complexity of what she did every day, how much she'd been holding together through her leadership. Mark's attorney scheduled a deposition with Mrs. Arena, clearly hoping she'd reveal some evidence that Rachel had promised Mark a company role. The deposition took place in a conference room downtown, with a court reporter recording every word. Mark's attorney asked about conversations Mrs. Arena had with Rachel regarding succession planning, whether Rachel ever mentioned wanting Mark involved in operations, and what Rachel's attitude toward Mark had been during her illness. Mrs. Arena answered each question calmly and precisely, explaining that Rachel explicitly wanted Mark kept separate from business operations and that she had documentation of Rachel's instructions to that effect. When the attorney suggested those instructions might have changed as Rachel's condition worsened, Mrs. Arena produced emails from Rachel's final weeks reiterating her position. The attorney tried to suggest Mrs. Arena was biased against Mark, that she was protecting her own position by blocking him from leadership. Mrs. Arena maintained professional composure throughout, simply repeating the facts without getting defensive or emotional. She described the morning Mark changed the locks, his presumptuous behavior toward employees, and his complete lack of understanding about how the company actually operated. By the end of the deposition, the attorney looked frustrated, clearly not getting the ammunition he'd hoped for. My deposition came next, and Mark's attorney tried a different approach with me. He painted me as an opportunistic brother who'd manipulated Rachel into giving me control while she was vulnerable and dying. He asked whether I'd pressured Rachel to make me majority shareholder, whether I'd taken advantage of her illness to grab power, and whether I felt any guilt about pushing Mark out of what should have been his inheritance. I explained calmly that Rachel made her own decisions about ownership structure years before her illness, that I'd been surprised to learn I was majority shareholder, and that I was honoring her wishes by protecting what she'd built. The attorney asked about my qualifications to run a manufacturing company, implying I was unfit for the role. I described my background and acknowledged I was learning, but emphasized that Rachel had trusted me, and that the employees supported my leadership. When the attorney asked if I'd consider giving Mark any settlement to resolve things amicably, I said no firmly. Rachel had been clear about her wishes. Mark had shown his true character through his actions, and I wouldn't reward his exploitation of her death with money he hadn't earned. The attorney pressed me on whether I was being vindictive, whether family harmony mattered less to me than control. I explained that Mark had destroyed any possibility of family harmony when he changed those locks the morning after Rachel's funeral, that his subsequent behavior only confirmed Rachel's judgment about his character. The deposition revealed something interesting about Mark's legal strategy. His attorney was working on contingency, expecting a percentage of whatever settlement they could extract from us. This explained the aggressive tactics and inflated claims. They weren't really expecting to win full ownership or prove Rachel had promised Mark anything. They were trying to pressure us into paying something rather than fighting, hoping we'd settle just to end the harassment and uncertainty. Mr. Huang noted this made them more likely to accept defeat if we stood firm through the hearing. A contingency attorney wouldn't want to waste time on a losing case when they could be pursuing more profitable clients. The aggressive posturing was essentially a bluff, testing whether we'd fold under pressure. Mr. Huang advised me to show zero willingness to negotiate, to make clear we'd fight this all the way through trial if necessary. Once Mark's attorney realized we wouldn't settle, they'd probably advise Mark to drop the whole thing rather than continue wasting everyone's time on a case they couldn't win. Rachel's parents called me from 3 states away. confused and upset about what was happening with Mark. They'd heard his version of events where he painted himself as the wronged party being pushed out by greedy in-laws who didn't respect his marriage to Rachel. Mark had apparently called them crying, claiming I was stealing his inheritance and destroying Rachel's wishes out of personal animosity. I explained the actual situation carefully, describing the ownership structure, Rachel's letter to me, and Mark's behavior since her death. They were shocked by the details but not entirely surprised by Mark's character. Rachel's father admitted they'd never fully trusted Mark's motivations for marrying Rachel. Her mother said they'd always felt Mark was more interested in what Rachel could provide than who she actually was as a person. They apologized for not warning Rachel more forcefully, though they acknowledged she'd been an adult making her own choices. I assured them Rachel had figured out Mark's character eventually, that her letter showed she understood exactly who he was. They asked if there was anything they could do to help, and I said their support meant everything, but the legal situation was under control. Rachel's mother shared something that explained a lot about Mark's financial desperation. Last year, Mark had tried to get them to co-sign a business loan application for $50,000. He'd claimed it was for a surprise gift for Rachel, some kind of business expansion she'd always dreamed about. They'd refused because something felt off about the whole request, the way Mark pushed them to sign quickly without letting them review the details. Rachel had called them a few weeks later to thank them for not signing anything Mark brought them, explaining that there was no business expansion, and she had no idea what Mark had actually wanted the money for. This pattern of financial manipulation had apparently extended throughout his marriage to Rachel. She'd kept their finances mostly separate after discovering Mark's tendency to spend money they didn't have and make commitments without discussing them. Rachel's mother said she wished they'd encouraged Rachel to divorce Mark years ago, but Rachel had been focused on her work and hadn't wanted to deal with the disruption of ending the marriage. 2 weeks before the hearing, headlights swept across my living room window at 11 at night. I looked out to see Mark's car in my driveway, parked crooked like he'd pulled in too fast. He got out stumbling slightly, clearly drunk, and walked up to my front door. I didn't open it, just stood in the dark hallway listening as he knocked and called my name. He said he needed to talk, that we were family and should work this out like adults. His words were slurred and emotional. He begged me to just give him something so he could start over, claimed he was broke and couldn't pay his bills. He said Rachel's medical bills had emptied their savings, that he had nothing left and needed money to survive. I turned on the porch light and spoke through the door, telling him he should discuss any settlement through his attorney and that he needed to leave my property immediately. Mark kept talking, his voice getting louder and more desperate. He said I didn't understand what it was like to watch someone die, to lose everything in one moment. I reminded him about the restraining order, that he was violating it by being here. He laughed bitterly and said the restraining order was just another way I was using the system against him. I pulled out my phone and told him I was calling the police if he didn't leave in the next 30 seconds. Mark finally stumbled back to his car, yelling that I'd regret this, that karma would catch up with me eventually. I watched him drive away too fast, then called the non-emergency police line to report the violation and get it documented for Mr. Huang. The next morning, I documented everything and sent it to Mr. Huang through his secure email. He called me within an hour and said Mark's behavior crossed several legal lines. We scheduled an emergency meeting at his office for that afternoon. When I arrived, he already had paperwork prepared for a restraining order. He walked me through the filing process and explained that Mark's late-night visit, combined with the previous office takeover and harassment, created a pattern the court would take seriously. We included everything in the petition: the unauthorized building access, the threatening emails, the confrontation at my home, and the clear violation of boundaries during a vulnerable time. Mr. Huang filed the paperwork electronically that same day and requested an expedited hearing given Mark's escalating behavior. The court scheduled a preliminary hearing for 3 days later. Mark's attorney received notification and immediately called Mr. Huang trying to negotiate. He claimed Mark was just emotional and grieving, that the late-night visit was a cry for help rather than harassment. Mr. Huang shut that down fast by pointing out that Mark had shown no actual grief, only financial desperation and manipulation attempts. The hearing took place in a small courtroom with just the judge, both attorneys, Mark, and me. Mark wore a suit and tried to look respectable, but his eyes were bloodshot and he kept fidgeting. His attorney argued that a restraining order was excessive, that Mark simply wanted to discuss settlement options as family, and that I was overreacting to a difficult situation. The judge asked Mark directly why he went to my home at night. Mark stammered something about needing to talk where we could be honest without lawyers interfering. The judge then asked if he'd been drinking. Mark admitted he'd had a couple beers but insisted he wasn't drunk. Mr. Huang presented our evidence, including my phone documentation of the incident, the timeline of Mark's behavior since Rachel's death, and witness statements from employees who'd seen his takeover attempt. The judge read through everything carefully, occasionally looking up at Mark with obvious disapproval. She asked Mark if he understood that I was the actual owner of the company. Mark started to argue about marital rights again, but his attorney cut him off and said yes, they understood the ownership structure. The judge granted a temporary restraining order on the spot. Mark couldn't contact me directly through any means, couldn't come within 500 feet of my home or the company property, and had to communicate only through attorneys if necessary. Mark's attorney objected and said this would make settlement discussions impossible. The judge said settlement discussions could happen through proper legal channels and that Mark's behavior had created this situation himself. Mark's face went red and he looked like he wanted to argue, but his attorney grabbed his arm and pulled him back down into his seat. The restraining order felt like the first real protection I'd had since Rachel died. I could finally focus on the company without constantly watching for Mark's next move. Mrs. Arena was relieved when I told her about the court order and said several employees had been nervous about Mark showing up again. 3 days before the main hearing on Mark's estate claims, his attorney sent a formal settlement proposal. They were willing to drop all ownership claims and stop challenging the corporate structure in exchange for a one-time payment equal to 6 months of Rachel's salary. Mr. Huang calculated the amount at roughly $72,000. He said this represented a major retreat from their original position where Mark thought he owned the entire company, but it was still a substantial sum for someone with absolutely no legitimate claim. The proposal letter tried to frame it as a reasonable compromise that would let both sides move forward without prolonged litigation. It mentioned Mark's contributions to Rachel's success through emotional support and household management, suggesting he deserved some recognition for enabling her career. I read the letter twice and felt my anger building with each sentence. Mark had done nothing to earn a single dollar from Rachel's work. He'd spent their marriage trying to exploit her success while contributing nothing himself. Mr. Huang asked what I wanted to do, and I told him to reject the settlement outright. He nodded and said he'd expected that answer, but wanted to make sure I understood it meant continuing through the full hearing process. I said I understood completely and would rather spend twice that amount on legal fees than give Mark anything he didn't legitimately deserve. Mr. Huang drafted a response declining the settlement and stating we were prepared to present our full case at the hearing. Mark's attorney called him directly after receiving the rejection, trying to negotiate a lower amount. Mr. Huang told him there would be no settlement at any price and that we were confident in our legal position. The hearing date arrived 2 weeks after the restraining order was issued. I got to the courthouse early and met Mr. Huang in the hallway outside the courtroom. He had 3 folders of evidence organized by topic and looked completely prepared. Mark showed up 15 minutes before the scheduled start time, wearing an expensive suit I'd never seen before. He'd probably bought it specifically for this hearing, trying to look like a successful business person rather than someone desperate for money. His attorney was a middle-aged man named Jackson, who looked tired and kept checking his watch. The courtroom was larger than the one for the restraining order hearing, with proper seating areas and an elevated judge's bench. The bailiff called the case and everyone took their positions. Mark's attorney went first since they were making the claim. He stood up and launched into an argument about marriage being an economic partnership where both spouses contribute to shared success. He claimed Mark had sacrificed his own career opportunities to support Rachel's demanding work schedule, that he'd managed their household and provided emotional stability that enabled her professional achievements. He talked about Mark's role during Rachel's illness, painting him as a devoted caregiver who put his own life on hold. The whole presentation was built on emotional appeals and broad assertions without any actual evidence. Jackson never provided documentation of Mark's supposed sacrifices or career opportunities he'd given up. He never showed proof of household management or caregiving beyond what any spouse would normally do. He just kept repeating that Mark deserved recognition for his contributions to Rachel's success. The judge listened without much expression, occasionally taking notes. When Jackson finished, she asked him directly what specific evidence he had of Mark's claimed sacrifices. He fumbled through his papers and mentioned that Mark had testimony prepared. The judge said she'd hear that testimony, but wanted to know if there was any documentary evidence. Jackson admitted there wasn't any formal documentation, but said the testimony would demonstrate the pattern of support. Mr. Huang stood up for our side and immediately shifted the tone from emotional appeals to hard facts. He walked through the corporate structure of the company, showing exactly how ownership was divided and why Rachel never held equity. He presented Rachel's employment contract with her signature clearly visible, highlighting the sections about compensation structure. He showed the judge Rachel's written letter to me, explaining her decisions and her concerns about Mark. Then he presented witness statements from Mrs. Arena, Vincent, and 3 other employees, describing Mark's behavior immediately after Rachel's death. The evidence painted a clear picture of someone who saw Rachel's illness as an opportunity rather than a tragedy, who planned his takeover while she was still alive, and who showed no actual grief once she passed. Mr. Huang also presented documentation of Mark's attempted fraud with the insurance company, his unauthorized access to company systems, and his harassment of clients. The judge paid close attention to every piece of evidence, asking occasional questions about dates and timelines. When Mr. Huang mentioned Mark's late-night visit to my home, the judge nodded and referenced the restraining order she'd already issued. Mr. Huang concluded by stating clearly that Mark had never worked for the company, never invested in it, never held any ownership stake, and had actively tried to exploit Rachel's death for personal financial gain. He argued that Mark deserved nothing beyond the legitimate spousal claims to Rachel's personal estate, which were being handled separately through probate. Mark took the stand looking nervous but trying to project confidence. His attorney asked him to describe his relationship with Rachel and his role in supporting her career. Mark launched into a prepared speech about how he'd encouraged Rachel's ambitions, how he'd handled household responsibilities so she could focus on work, how he'd been there for her during difficult business decisions. He made it sound like he'd been her partner in building the company, conveniently leaving out that he'd never actually been involved in any business operations. Jackson asked about Mark's caregiving during Rachel's illness. Mark's voice got emotional as he described taking her to appointments, managing her medications, and staying by her side through treatments. Some of it was probably true, but he made it sound like heroic sacrifice rather than what any decent spouse would do. Then Mr. Huang stood up for cross-examination, and the whole performance fell apart. He started by asking Mark when he'd first contacted the locksmith about changing Rachel's office locks. Mark hesitated and tried to claim he didn't remember exactly. Mr. Huang pulled out phone records showing Mark had called the locksmith 3 days before Rachel died. Mark's face went pale, and he stammered something about wanting to be prepared. Mr. Huang asked if being prepared meant planning to take over before Rachel's funeral. Mark said he was just trying to ensure business continuity. Mr. Huang then asked about the emails Mark sent from Rachel's computer announcing his takeover. Mark tried to justify them as necessary communication, but couldn't explain why he'd sent them before even talking to me or the board. The questions kept coming and Mark's credibility crumbled with each answer. Mr. Huang got him to admit he'd never worked for the company, never attended a board meeting, never invested a single dollar in operations. He admitted changing the locks the morning after Rachel's funeral. He admitted trying to install Kyle in a management position, despite Kyle having no qualifications. He admitted contacting clients without authorization and trying to renegotiate contracts. He admitted going to my home late at night after drinking. Every admission made Mark look worse, and his attorney kept trying to object, but the judge allowed the questioning to continue. By the time Mr. Huang finished, Mark was sweating and couldn't maintain eye contact. His whole devoted husband image had been destroyed by his own admissions. Jackson tried redirect questioning to repair the damage, but it was pointless. Mark had already revealed his true motivations through his actions. The judge took a 15-minute recess to review all the evidence and testimony. When she returned, she didn't waste time with lengthy deliberation. She stated clearly that Mark had no ownership claim to the company under any legal theory. The corporate structure was valid and properly established. Rachel's choice to take salary instead of equity was her decision to make. Mark's status as surviving spouse gave him rights to Rachel's personal estate through probate, but that was entirely separate from the company ownership. The judge noted that Mark's behavior immediately after Rachel's death demonstrated opportunism rather than grief. She specifically mentioned the locksmith, the unauthorized emails, and the attempt to install an unqualified nephew in management. She said these actions showed Mark's true priorities and undermined any claim that he was acting in Rachel's interests or the company's interests. She ruled that Mark had no standing to challenge the corporate structure, no right to any company compensation beyond what Rachel had legitimately earned and would pass through her estate, and no basis for any settlement payment. Jackson immediately requested reconsideration, arguing that the ruling didn't account for Mark's non-financial contributions to Rachel's success. The judge cut him off and said she'd considered everything presented, and her ruling stood. Mark's face went from pale to red as the reality sank in. He'd lost completely and publicly. The judge signed the order right there and handed copies to both attorneys. Mr. Huang thanked her and gathered his materials. I felt relief wash over me, but stayed quiet until we were out of the courtroom. In the hallway, Mr. Huang shook my hand and said the ruling was exactly what we'd hoped for. Mark had no grounds for appeal, and the case was effectively over. We walked toward the exit and I thought we were done, but Mark was waiting outside the courthouse doors. He saw me coming and his face twisted with anger. He started yelling that I'd stolen his future, that I'd manipulated the system against him, that Rachel would be ashamed of what I'd done. Security guards nearby noticed the commotion and started moving toward us. Mr. Huang stepped between Mark and me while pulling out his phone to document everything. Mark kept yelling about how I'd destroyed his life, how I'd taken everything that should have been his. His attorney Jackson rushed over and tried to pull Mark away, clearly panicked that his client was violating the restraining order in front of witnesses. Mark shoved Jackson's hand away and took a step toward me. The security guards reached us before anything physical happened. They positioned themselves between Mark and me while one of them spoke into his radio. Mr. Huang was recording the whole incident on his phone, making sure to capture Mark's words and actions clearly. Jackson finally got through to Mark that he was making everything worse. He grabbed Mark's arm firmly and pulled him toward the parking lot. Mark went with him but kept looking back and yelling threats about karma and consequences. The security guards stayed with us until Mark's car left the parking lot. One of them took my statement about what happened and said they'd file a report. Mr. Huang already had his recording and said this was clear evidence of restraining order violation. We went back inside and filed an emergency motion for contempt of court right there at the courthouse. The clerk processed it immediately given that the violation had just happened on courthouse property. The judge who'd issued the restraining order was still in the building and agreed to hear the contempt motion the following week. Mr. Huang said Mark's inability to control himself, even after losing the case completely, would likely result in stricter enforcement of the order. The contempt hearing happened 6 days later in the same small courtroom where the original restraining order was issued. Mark showed up looking defeated, his expensive suit replaced with casual clothes that looked slept in. Jackson argued that Mark's outburst was heat-of-the-moment emotion after a difficult ruling, that he didn't physically approach me, and that he'd left when told to do so. He asked the judge to consider the emotional context and not impose harsh penalties for what was essentially words spoken in anger. Mr. Huang played his phone recording of the incident. Mark's voice came through clearly threatening me, saying I'd stolen from him, claiming Rachel would want him to fight back. The recording showed Mark approaching despite the restraining order and only stopping when security intervened. The judge watched the video with obvious disapproval. She asked Mark directly if he understood what a restraining order meant. Mark mumbled something about understanding but being upset. The judge said, upset or not, violating a court order had consequences. She noted this was exactly why restraining orders existed, to prevent emotional confrontations from escalating into dangerous situations. She found Mark in contempt and issued a formal warning. She also extended the restraining order for a full year instead of the original 6 months and added stricter terms. Mark couldn't be within 1,000 feet of me instead of 500. He couldn't mention my name on social media or in any public forum. Any further violation would result in immediate arrest and potential jail time. Jackson tried to argue the extended terms were excessive, but the judge shut that down. She said Mark had proven he couldn't control himself and needed clear boundaries with serious consequences. Mark sat there looking like he'd finally realized he'd lost everything he'd tried to gain. After the contempt hearing, the legal battle was finally over. Mark had no more claims to pursue, no more arguments to make, and a court order keeping him away from me and the company. I could finally stop defending and start actually leading. The first thing I did was meet with Mrs. Irina to establish a regular schedule for financial reviews. She walked me through the monthly reporting cycle, explained which metrics mattered most, and showed me how to spot potential problems before they became serious. We set up weekly meetings where she'd brief me on cash flow, client payments, and any financial concerns. I also started doing regular check-ins with major clients, introducing myself properly as the owner, and making sure they felt confident in the company's stability. Several mentioned they'd been worried during the chaos with Mark, but were reassured by how professionally we'd handled the situation. I made a point to visit the production floor at least twice a week, talking to employees and learning the actual manufacturing processes. Rachel had known every aspect of operations, and I needed to build that same knowledge base. The workers appreciated seeing me engaged rather than hiding in the executive office. Linus walked me through production schedules and quality control processes. Riley showed me the engineering projects in development. Vincent helped me understand client relationship histories and preferences. I wasn't Rachel and never would be, but I was learning to lead in my own way while honoring the foundation she'd built. The company culture she'd created, where employees felt valued and clients felt prioritized, that was worth protecting. I made decisions differently than Rachel would have, sometimes more cautiously, and sometimes more willing to take risks in areas where I had confidence. But the core values stayed the same because those values were what made the company successful. Mrs. Irina told me one afternoon that Rachel would be proud of how I'd stepped up. I wanted to believe that was true. The Employee Trust Board meeting happened 2 weeks after the contempt hearing. I sat at the conference table with 7 board members who represented the employee shareholders, feeling like I was interviewed for a job I already technically had. Mrs. Irina sat beside me, which helped calm my nerves. The board chair was a guy named Thomas who'd worked in production for 20 years before retiring. He started by saying they'd watched how I handled Mark's takeover attempt and the legal battles that followed. They appreciated that I'd protected the company and kept operations stable during a difficult time. Then he asked what my vision was for Hanjin Manufacturing going forward. I admitted I was still learning the business and didn't have Rachel's experience, but I wanted to maintain the company culture she'd built while finding opportunities for growth. Another board member, a woman named Sarah from Quality Control, asked how I planned to make major decisions without Rachel's expertise. I explained that I was meeting regularly with department heads, learning operations from the ground up, and relying on people like Mrs. Irina and Linus who knew the business inside out. Thomas nodded and said that was exactly the right approach. He told me Rachel had been the same way when she first took over as CEO 15 years ago, listening more than talking and building trust with employees. Sarah added that Rachel used to spend time on the production floor every week, and several workers had mentioned seeing me do the same thing. The board voted unanimously to formally recognize me as permanent company leader and offered their full support. After the meeting ended, Thomas pulled me aside and shared a story about Rachel's first year as CEO. She'd made a decision to turn down a huge contract because the client wanted to cut corners on quality standards. Everyone thought she was crazy to walk away from that much money, but she said Hanjin Manufacturing's reputation was worth more than any single deal. 6 months later, that same client came back offering better terms because their cut-rate supplier had failed them. Thomas said Rachel understood that doing things right mattered more than doing things fast or cheap, and he could see I had the same values. I felt the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders, but also the support of people who genuinely wanted me to succeed. Riley knocked on my office door 3 days later, carrying a thick folder and looking excited. She asked if I had time to discuss a project idea, and I waved her in. She spread out research documents and preliminary designs across my desk, explaining that Rachel had been interested in expanding into a new product line before her illness. The idea was to use our existing manufacturing equipment to produce specialized components for the renewable energy sector. Riley had done market research showing strong demand and decent profit margins. She'd even contacted potential clients who expressed interest in working with us. I asked why Rachel hadn't moved forward with it, and Riley explained that Rachel wanted to wait until after some equipment upgrades were complete. Those upgrades had happened 2 months ago, right before Rachel's condition worsened. I studied Riley's projections and technical specifications, impressed by how thoroughly she'd prepared. She wasn't just pitching an idea, she'd done actual work developing it. I asked what she needed to move forward, and she said a budget of $30,000 for prototype development and testing. If the prototypes worked, we could scale up production using existing capacity during slower periods. It was my first real strategic decision as owner, not just defending against Mark or maintaining operations. I approved the budget and told Riley to keep me updated on progress. Her face lit up and she thanked me before gathering her materials. After she left, I realized this was what leadership actually meant. Not just protecting what existed, but finding ways to grow and evolve. Mark's attorney sent a letter the following week that Mr. Huang forwarded to me with a note saying it was probably their final attempt. The letter proposed dropping the contempt proceedings if Mark agreed to cease all contact and claims permanently. Mr. Huang had already drafted a counter-proposal that formalized everything. Mark would acknowledge in writing that he had no ownership rights to Hanjin Manufacturing, agree to the extended restraining order, and release all claims against me and the company. In exchange, we wouldn't pursue additional legal action for his restraining order violations. Mr. Huang explained this was actually a reasonable settlement because Mark's attorney probably realized they couldn't win and wanted to end the case cleanly. Continuing to fight Mark served no real purpose now that the company was secure and his claims were defeated. I asked if Mark might violate the agreement later, and Mr. Huang said everything would be documented so we could pursue immediate sanctions if he tried anything. The settlement also included a clause where Mark agreed never to contact Hanjin employees or clients or make any public statements about the company. Mr. Huang negotiated back and forth with Mark's attorney for a few days, tightening the language and closing potential loopholes. I signed off on the final settlement agreement after reviewing it twice. Mark's attorney scheduled a signing meeting at their office, and Mr. Huang went alone because I didn't need to be there. He called me afterward and said Mark had signed everything without comment, looking defeated and tired. His attorney had seemed relieved to be done with the case, probably exhausted from dealing with Mark's unrealistic expectations. Mr. Huang filed the settlement with the court, making it official and enforceable. If Mark violated any terms, we could go straight to contempt proceedings without having to prove a new case. I felt something release in my chest, a tension I'd been carrying since the morning Mark changed the office locks. The legal battle was finally over, not because Mark accepted he was wrong, but because he'd run out of options and energy to keep fighting. Rachel's estate closed 2 months later after the probate court processed everything. Her personal attorney handled the details, but I stayed informed about the process. Mark received what he was legally entitled to as surviving spouse, which included their house, her personal savings, and half of their joint assets. It was probably close to $400,000 total, substantial money, but nowhere near the millions he'd hoped to extract from the company. I heard through a mutual friend that Mark had sold the house and moved to Arizona, supposedly to start fresh somewhere without constant reminders of his failed power grab. The friend said Mark was telling people out there that he'd been a business executive in manufacturing, which made me angry, but wasn't worth pursuing. Let him reinvent his history somewhere else as long as he stayed away from us. Rachel's personal items went to her parents and me according to her will. I got her collection of business books, some family photos, and a watch our father had given her. Her parents took most of her personal belongings and seemed grateful the legal chaos was finally over. They apologized for not being more involved during the crisis, but I understood they were dealing with their own grief. 3 months after Rachel's death, I organized a memorial event at the company. We held it in the main production building after hours, setting up chairs and a small stage where people could share memories. Over 100 employees showed up, including several who'd retired years ago. People told stories about Rachel's early days building the company, her attention to detail, her willingness to listen to suggestions from anyone regardless of their position. One production worker described how Rachel had personally thanked him for catching a quality issue that could have ruined a major shipment. Another talked about Rachel attending his daughter's graduation because she knew how important it was to him. Mrs. Arena spoke about Rachel's integrity and how she never asked employees to do anything she wouldn't do herself. I managed to get through my own speech about Rachel's vision and values without completely breaking down. Afterward, I announced we were establishing a scholarship fund in Rachel's name for children of employees pursuing manufacturing or engineering degrees. The fund would start with $50,000 from company profits and accept ongoing contributions. Several employees came up afterward to thank me and share more memories. It felt like the right way to honor Rachel's commitment to the people who made Hanjin Manufacturing successful. Vincent approached me the next week about transitioning his role. He'd been Rachel's executive assistant for 8 years and knew the company inside out. I asked him to become my chief of staff, a title that acknowledged his institutional knowledge and organizational skills. He'd help me navigate company culture, understand the unwritten rules Rachel operated by, and manage my schedule and priorities. Vincent accepted and said he appreciated the recognition. Our working relationship was different from what he'd had with Rachel, more collaborative and less assistant-driven, but it worked well. He'd anticipate problems before they developed and knew which issues needed my immediate attention versus what could be handled by department heads. He also protected my time, screening requests and managing the constant flow of decisions that came across my desk. Vincent told me one afternoon that Rachel had specifically mentioned me to him during her final weeks. She'd said I had good instincts and would figure out leadership in my own way. Hearing that helped during moments when I doubted whether I was doing things right. The company's financial performance stayed stable through the transition period. Mrs. Arena showed me the quarterly reports with satisfaction, noting that revenue was actually up slightly compared to the previous year. We'd secured 2 new major clients who appreciated our reliability during a difficult period. One client specifically mentioned that our professional handling of the ownership transition gave them confidence in our stability. Mrs. Arena attributed the success to employee dedication and the clear leadership structure we'd maintained despite Mark's disruption. I felt proud that Rachel's legacy was continuing to grow, rather than just surviving. The employees had rallied around protecting what she built, and that collective commitment showed in our performance. I made sure to acknowledge their efforts during department meetings and company communications. I finally moved into Rachel's office 4 months after her death. I'd been working from a smaller office down the hall, unable to face occupying her space, but it felt wrong to leave her office empty, like a shrine to the past instead of a functional workspace. I had it redecorated with new furniture and paint, keeping some of her personal touches but making it my own space. Her certifications stayed on the wall, along with photos of company milestones. I added my own books and a few items that felt comfortable. The first day sitting at the desk felt strange, like I was pretending to be someone I wasn't, but gradually it became my office, the place where I made decisions that affected the same people Rachel had cared about. Some days I still imagined asking her advice, wondering what she would do in a particular situation, but I was learning to trust my own judgment, informed by her example and the guidance of people who knew the business. Riley's prototype development was progressing well. She scheduled a demonstration 6 weeks after I'd approved the initial budget, showing me the first working samples. The engineering team had solved several technical challenges and produced components that met the quality standards renewable energy companies required. Riley was excited about the potential, and her enthusiasm was catching. I approved full development funding of $200,000 to set up a dedicated production line and hire 2 additional engineers. It was a bigger investment than the prototype phase, but the market research supported it. The engineering team threw themselves into the challenge, and I could see how Rachel must have felt watching the company evolve and expand over the years. This wasn't just maintaining what existed, it was building something new that could carry us forward. The Employee Trust Board sent me an invitation 2 weeks later, asking me to attend their quarterly dinner at a restaurant downtown. Vincent mentioned Rachel had started this tradition 5 years ago, wanting to keep the connection between ownership and the people actually doing the work. I showed up nervous, not sure what to expect from these meetings. The board consisted of 7 employees elected by their co-workers to represent different departments and shifts. They greeted me warmly, and over dinner they shared stories about the company's early days when Rachel's father was still alive. One woman named Ella worked in shipping for 23 years and remembered when the whole operation fit in a single warehouse. She described how Rachel would spend time on the production floor learning every job, understanding what each person contributed to the final product. Another board member talked about his daughter's college education, paid for partly through profit sharing the trust provided. These weren't just workers collecting paychecks, they were people whose lives depended on Hanjin Manufacturing staying stable and successful. Their questions were thoughtful, asking about the new product line Riley was developing and whether I planned to maintain Rachel's commitment to employee benefits. I realized Rachel had structured ownership this way because she understood that a company only succeeds when everyone has real stake in its future. She'd given them 49% not out of charity, but because they'd earned it through years of dedication. 6 months passed since Rachel died, and I noticed something had shifted in how I thought about my role. I'd stopped mentally adding the word temporary before my title, stopped imagining this was just until someone more qualified took over. The change happened gradually through hundreds of small moments, decisions about client contracts, conversations with department heads, budget approvals that shaped the company's direction. I was building on what Rachel created, but adding my own perspective, trusting my instincts instead of constantly wondering what she would have done. Mrs. Arena commented one afternoon that my management style was different from Rachel's, but equally effective in its own way. I'd never be Rachel, could never replace what she brought to Hanjin Manufacturing, but I was becoming the leader this company needed now. The employees had accepted me not because I was Rachel's brother, but because I'd proven myself through consistent decisions that honored her values while moving the company forward. I felt the weight of responsibility, but also the satisfaction of knowing I was protecting something worth protecting. Mark's name rarely came up anymore, except when someone used him as an example of what not to do. New hires had no idea about his failed takeover attempt. They just knew the company had clear ownership and stable leadership. The production floor ran smoothly, clients were satisfied, and the employee trust board remained confident in our direction. Mark had become irrelevant to our daily operations, a cautionary tale about mistaking proximity to success for actual achievement. I heard through distant connections that he'd moved to another state and was working in sales somewhere, hopefully learning that real success requires actual effort and contribution. The company had moved past his disruption completely, focused on growth opportunities and maintaining the culture Rachel had built over 15 years. Sometimes I wondered if Mark ever understood how badly he'd misread the situation, how his greed had destroyed any sympathy people might have felt for him as Rachel's widower. I sat in my office reviewing the quarterly financial reports, noting that revenue was up 12% compared to the same period last year. Riley's new product line was generating interest from 3 potential clients, and Mrs. Arena projected we'd need to hire 4 additional production workers by next quarter. My eyes landed on the coffee mug still sitting on the shelf, the one I'd given Rachel 3 years ago that said "World's Okayest CEO." It made me smile instead of bringing tears now, a reminder of her humor and the humility she brought to leadership, despite building something remarkable. Rachel had created a company strong enough to survive her loss and Mark's attack, structured it to protect the people who made it work, and trusted me to carry it forward. The employees were thriving, the business was stable, and every product we manufactured carried forward the legacy she'd built through years of dedication and smart decisions. I felt honored to protect what she created and excited about where we could take it next, building on her foundation while writing the next chapter of Hanjin Manufacturing's story.